Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 26th year of production, I interview writers about their craft, what they're creating now, what they've accomplished in the past, what they might be planning for the future. Sometimes the writers are poets, sometimes they're short story writers, sometimes they're novelists, sometimes they are historians. It's a pretty broad net. We even splurge to other sorts of artists. We have had on musicians and actors, sculptors. It's a wide scope we cater to. So if you have an idea for a writer or other artist who might be good for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be glad to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the other original productions that come out of Cape Ann TV for Essex, Rockport, Manchester, and Gloucester are a creation of Cable Access TV, a wonderful community service that is not available on Dish. So if you see those commercials, don't pay attention. Tonight, I'm very proud to say we do have a writer, a very distinguished art historian, Professor Madeline Caviness, making her second appearance on the Writer's Block, I'm very happy to say. Madeline Caviness was born in London and educated in Cambridge, and then came to the United States and was further educated at Harvard, where she took a PhD and as an art historian. She's been teaching for a few decades at Tufts and at times at MIT. I've asked her to be on the show tonight for the specific reason that she was the co-author of a book called Ancestors of Christ Windows at Canterbury Cathedral with Jeffrey Weaver, which was the exhibit book that accompanied Radiant Light, an exhibit that ran at the Getty in California in the late months of 2013 and early 2014, and then at the Cloisters, the Upper West Side branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Gloucester. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Madeline Caviness again back to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's been too long. I think it was 11 years.
Do we know how long?
11, I could look it up, but it seems like yesterday. You have published widely in studying medieval art and other art. And I know it's beyond medieval art, but especially in medieval art. And I'm curious first of how that interest developed. How early and where did it come from?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think for me it was partly growing up in England, so it's all around you. And my elder brother had an interest in archaeology, and we used to go around and think we were digging up important things and looking at old churches and so on. But it was, in a way, sadly, after I'd finished at college that I really decided I wanted to study art in a serious way. And so at Cambridge, as an undergraduate, I fooled around with archaeology, anthropology, English literature. It didn't do me any harm, but I needed to get some serious training once I decided that medieval art history was what I loved the best.
And you decided that towards the end of your undergraduate
I think
period?
It was because I went to Italy. My parents were very generous, and they let me go to Italy for a month when I finished college, and I was to learn Italian, of course. And I made an interesting discovery in this wonderful Uffizi Museum in Florence, where all the great Italian paintings are laid out chronologically. And I kept going back to see if I could get beyond the 16th century. And I didn't even like the 16th century. I used to turn around and go back into the Middle Ages. That was what I realized, that just, for whatever reason that is.
So the 16th century
appealed to me.
Too recent.
It's too recent, yes.
Do you know where that comes from? Does it go back to early archaeological perceptions around where you grew up?
Probably, quite possibly. I had actually become a convinced atheist, and I still am, but I was absolutely fascinated with religious art. So that was the other part of it.
I want to mention an earlier book, The Early Stained Glass of Canterbury Cathedral, which we discussed when you were on before. And this deals chiefly, I think, with 12th and 13th century, end of the 12th, early 13th century art,
yes,
which is in your safe
in my
area.
safe, yes, my safe area.
I want to make sure we hold up the book which accompanied the Radiant Light exhibit, The Ancestors of Christ Windows at Canterbury Cathedral. I kind of expect that to be...
It's a beautiful book, if I could say so, because
Absolutely.
the Getty produced it, and they make sure that their plates are perfect.
So was the Getty the originator, the big
Yes.
mover, not the Met?
No, the Getty.
When I first heard of this, I was a little surprised that it was in California first.
Yeah, no, it was definitely a Getty show. Jeffrey Weaver is a curator at the Getty, and they had all the means to install it well. In earthquake country, there has to be special precautions, of course, and it's beautifully done.
They're all back safely now.
Oh, yes.
Are they up yet? Or are they still in storage?
The first thing they did was put them up again in the cathedral in the chapter house, not yet up in the big windows, because the stonework is still being repaired, where they will go back. And English people apparently flooded to see them. You know, it was a sort of welcome home. They'd been away for a while. And so it was a very popular exhibition there, in a smaller building than the great cathedral. And so they could be seen just as well as we could see them in the museum here.
I certainly want to mention that the book has magnificent color photographs in it, and we'll see some more of this in a couple of minutes. Can we get a zoom on that? Can we come in closer? Yes, that's...
You may have got a slip in the way.
Beautiful, vibrant color, and there are many color pages in this book that you did with Mr. Weaver. Tell us what came over from Canterbury Cathedral.
Let me think. Was it 8 figures? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 6 of the almost life-size figures. Most of them from the earliest part of the series. I know you're particularly fond of that early master, as am I, who began glazing in the north side of the choir as soon as the building was ready to have windows again. But they also had a couple from the transept. That's the Noah, who's a little bit later, and Shem. And then it shows the kind of development over the first period of the glazing. So it was a very good choice. And where they didn't have matching figures to fill a window, they put very large, I think you have a slide which will probably come up in a while, the 3 windows together. And they made a photographic facsimiles, but in black and white, so nobody was fooled by them. But you could get a sense of the scale and the way they had originally been installed in the cathedral. But of course they have a very long history, and they haven't been in their own windows since the 18th century. They were taken out then and put in a very different order, chaotic order, in 2 huge 15th century windows.
It's very difficult to trace those orders and those changes.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, as a sort of archaeologist and working from scaffolds when I did that book and looking very closely, I've actually found the numbers incised with a diamond on each one of these figures that were made in the 18th century, which recorded the order they were in before they took them down.
Oh, so they did think ahead a little. And behind.
They numbered them.
We do have some images. You mentioned we have 6 different slides we can show.
Yes,
and
good.
I'd love it if you could. We could show show all, and you could describe what we're looking at.
Or shall we begin with Jared, because
okay,
his
let's
original
begin
head.
with Jared.
There he is. Now, one of the problems, of course, is with very, very old glass is that
This is Jared.
This is Jared. Yareth, right? They all have their Latin name, of course. There's always some part or another that's had to be replaced. And he's, however, one of the best preserved of all the figures. And his head is perfect, which is quite unusual.
His head is original glass.
It's original glass.
And who created this image?
Well, I invented a master when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. I called him the Methuselah master. We didn't have the Methuselah, in the exhibition. He's very comparable to Jared in quality. And I was thinking when you mentioned that before, you like the name, you know, scientists often call things, or doctors call things for themselves. They've invented some surgical procedure. But art historians call things for the work of art. So for Methuselah that he painted.
So as an art historian, you had the power to dub the creator of this and other images, the Methuselah master.
It's a kind of shortcut. Once you've recognized a rather personal style, and not all of the glass has such a personal style, sometimes it's like workshop painting, you know. But really, I think this first glass painter who worked, as they were finishing the choir, there had been a disastrous fire following the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, and it had given the monks a chance to rebuild on larger scale, and suddenly we had Gothic architecture, so it's much larger than the building had been before, much higher, and to devise a whole new program and bring in new artists. And it was a magical moment. The 1180s, both sides of the channel, there were wonderful things going on.
Now, when you say that it was created by the Methuselah master, is that an individual or is that a studio? And you just
he would have had helpers. He would have had a shop. I mean, if I name him he, I probably could equally think of it as a collective. But when you look at the way the faces are painted, just the way the brush is laid on the glass and so on, and the drapery, it's very distinctive.
So there's an individual.
Very distinctive. There's an individual doing the important parts. And then, of course, there are borders around, or the foliage that you see just out of the edge of the frame here. That would be assistants.
So, so the glass goes up in sections that are leaded in, and it's clear before the master begins to...
He doesn't paint colour. The colour is in the glass. He has the glass manufactured, most likely, hand-picks what he wants, but the green glass you see there, the wonderful brilliant green, is a copper oxide added to the molten material for the glass, the silicas and potash, in the kiln, and it turns green if you have enough oxidation and so on. It's a tricky business.
So
the purple around the garment, the edging is probably magnesium. Cobalt is used.
So there's chemical manipulation of color as well as painting.
Oh yes, the painting actually is the black detail. It's the trace line, the eyes, the nose, the beard, those details.
So that is Jared.
That's Jared.
What would be another of our panels that would be good to discuss? We have the three panels.
Enoch is a wonderful one. Do we have Enoch?
We have three panels, Thara, Noah, Thara and Abraham in a single and phallic.
Well, let's look at Noah next then.
Let's look at Noah then. We can look at...
This is a different painter, different designer.
Noah. Describe what we're looking at here, would you, Madeline?
This is a figure that's so active because they were thinking about Noah's interaction when he built the ark and talked to God and so on. So unlike several of them just are seated looking like rather magisterial and passive, Noah is wanting to be somewhere else. And you look at the way his garments are so agitated and one knee is high up and one leg. He feels a very active, kind of leaping figure. He's almost leaping, yes, hand on the hip. And he's not as kind of naturalistic, if one can say that, of any medieval art, as the Jared Methuselah. He's flatter. I know the last glass restorer at Canterbury, who was rather sort of unfortunate because he didn't much appreciate the glass, used to say that they didn't know how to draw in the 12th century, and he would love to have done some things like correcting the outline of Noah in places, and I'm so glad that it couldn't be done because it's a wonderful energetic figure anyway.
What is the name designation for the creator of Noah?
I don't think I invented another master that I remember, but there's one that worked in the transepts. No, actually, it might have been the parable of the sower, linking it to lower windows, but definitely different, not a different generation, but enough different in date, but perhaps 5 years. And they've got around into a different part of the building.
And what,
So the architecture over the figure, that's a new, rather updated aspect.
what year was that created approximately?
This would have been about 1181. The others were probably 1178 or so.
Methuselah was earlier.
Yeah, 78 or so, as far as we can tell. Now, Noah has an original head, but it's so weathered. Sometimes these pinkish glasses for flesh tones are terribly attacked by acidic rain and whatever else bad has been against them outside. They're now protected with an exterior protective glazing, but for hundreds of years they were not. And when I first examined Noah from a scaffold, I could actually look through his face, through a hole in his face, into the interior of the cathedral. And that has had to be very expertly filled with resins and then a protective outer plate and so on. But I'm glad that they didn't repaint. You know, you can't recapture what's lost. There's no
700 years is a long time for
glass to
piece of
stand.
glass to survive.
Yes.
What?
So-
let me see. So we've seen
So why
Noah.
don't we go to
We
look at Sarah and Abraham together first. And we'll see
Sarah
how
and
they.
Abraham, the single slide with Sarah on top and Abraham below.
Below.
So this is as you would see it in the cathedral if we were looking up from.
No, this is as you would have seen it in the cathedral before the 18th century. So one of the exciting things about the Getty show was that the first time since then they could put figures that we know belong together in the size of lancet that they had originally been in, and the border. It's all original border around them as well, because they had been moved and taken apart, scattered in 2 different huge windows of the cathedral. So it was really quite a wonderful thing, even for me. You know, I could make photo montages and I could imagine, but I'd never actually seen them together before.
Will they be together when the reconstruction in Canterbury is finished?
I'm afraid not. They'll be going back in the 18th century order, but that's, at least I believe not.
And these appeared in the same designs at the cloisters.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, yes. And when you do have them together, you can see how well the border design complements them. It's a wonderful rhythm of these elliptical shapes that give a sense of sort of measuring out the figures.
Who was the creator of Sarah and Abraham, or the creators of Sarah and
Well,
Abraham?
I think Sarah is a major painter. He's a great colorist, and you get to a point. Probably it was a bigger shop by then. They had a lot to do, and you might have a head man designing and others painting, and so it gets
Sort
more
of
complicated
like a
as they go
studio
on.
in Italy in the Renaissance.
Very much, yes.
And the same period, late 13th century?
Is it, well, late 12th or, yes, 80s, 1180s. They're working in the transept by now. 1181, if I remember my history.
12th.
They were able to begin to use part of the building. So they were working very hard on this rebuild of the choir. And 1181, they had closed off just exactly where they got to that winter, put the main altar back into use, had their saints' relics brought in, which was the most important thing. And the monks described that moment as them singing as if they had gone to paradise because they were in their new choir. It's a wonderful thing. 1181.
What year was Becket killed?
73, I think.
73.
Yeah. 73 is a new.
So this is not a
This is a long time
reclusive,
ago.
peaceful, medieval retreat.
Oh no!
at
The
all.
politics were terrible.
Yes, the monks were fighting.
The monks were fighting their archbishop. That
Yeah.
was very common. All kinds of things.
Now we have also, three panels. We have another Thara, and we have phallic.
We could look at the 3 panels together from the Getty and see how these two. Yes, see,
Okay.
this is what they were able to do at the Getty, was put 3 windows together, and the upper part of the lateral ones, left and right, are those just black and white photographs that I mentioned. So they're not trying to kid you. That is Methuselah on the left, but not the real thing and not in color, the upper left with Lamech. So that's how they worked in the window together.
So this was in a big space that gave
Yes.
depth
Yeah.
and resonance
Yeah,
to the
plenty.
art.
Yes, it was a little differently done at the cloisters, very satisfactory as well, but they bent them around a central piece, so you had an effect of them going back into distance.
Did you help arrange, or I want to say arrange the pieces in California and
No,
and here?
not beyond what I'd done in the book, of course, which was to reconstruct every window so that they knew which figures belonged with which, and the borders the same. So the raw material was there in the book, but they did it.
I suppose they've got a lot of experience in arranging.
Well, I think they brought
art
over,
with
there's
the-
a wonderful conservator who's full-time at Canterbury, Leonie Thanager, and I'm sure she came over with her people to handle the glass and install it and make sure they'd got their earthquake protections and everything that had been promised. And she would have done the same at the cloisters.
Imagine what the insurance cost
I have no idea,
to bring those over here.
no idea. Yeah.
We have a couple of more slides. We have an individual slide of phallic
Yes.
and an individual slide of Thera.
Yeah, let's look at phallic.
Let's look at
Yes.
phallic. It's Phalec, and I'm embarrassed to say I hadn't heard of him until I read about him in Canterbury.
Well,
But he's an
it's-
ancestor.
He's one of the ancestors, because there are rather a lot of them, and we
Yeah,
don't
there's a
all
long
recite
li-
them
a long,
all
long
the
list,
time.
yeah.
In the Middle Ages, they recited them every year on Christmas and other times too. This is a wonderfully colourful figure, and his head is completely new. It's 19th century, but the rest is good. And
So everything,
he's,
now this is, in contrast to the earlier ones, the head is the only piece here that's not original? Or virtually?
Yeah, virtually, yeah. There's a lot of mending leads. Can you see what the black leads are like? A sort of spider's web, and they interfere a bit with the way you see the glass. Well, that's because the larger pieces of glass have broken and had to be mended. And
So if we were seeing this right after it went in place originally in
it,
1200,
it
it would be
except
much
the head.
more fluid, or much more...
much clearer to read. Much clearer, yes. Well, one of the great delights in working on this again, because it would be incredibly boring to say the same thing I said 20 years ago, I really looked much more closely at the attention being paid to the ancestors of Christ at this time, and found most liturgies had a place for a recitation of them, and many, many buildings included them in some form, including a couple that probably imitated Canterbury, one in Spain and one in France. So this had become pretty well known.
I know from your earlier work, you've traveled extensively on the continent, comparing
Yes.
subject matter, and I think
And so on.
sometimes the artists have
Yes.
moved back and forth.
Certainly one of the slightly later groups of figures here were designed by artists who also worked in Reims. So my next book after that was a big fat yellow book on a wonderful abbey church called Saint-Remy of Reims. Not the cathedral, but the abbey church of Reims. And a related building in Braine, which is a village really outside Soissons, but had been a very wealthy foundation by a royal woman in the 12th century. And there's even a document there that says that that particular woman, Agnes of Braine, got beautiful glass from her cousin, the princess in England, but that's still actually a little uncertain of which generation or who, but a connection anyway. So of course the glass painters were traveling those routes.
I wanted to take up on that mention of that woman from the 12th century, I think you said, because you have studied, besides medieval art or through medieval art, women's roles in the period.
not?
And
Yes.
in your next book, I asked you how to pronounce this before the show. I'll try. Women and Jews in Sachsenspiegel picture books.
Yes.
Is the
That's
book
what
that's
I'm
almost
forever
complete?
trying to finish, very nearly.
So
If I wasn't
you've
going
done,
away in the next couple of weeks, that would be done.
I had wanted to get to this earlier because we're almost out of time, but
Yes.
You study the roles of women as you
Yes.
interpret them through the art.
Yes. Representations of them. In some cases, I've looked at patronage of women ordering art, but in this particular case, it's the first written German law in the 13th century. Very widespread in Europe, actually, translated into every language. 500 manuscripts preserved. The Sachsenspiegel is a German icon. And amazingly, in the 14th century, very wealthy patrons produced picture books. Every single page has one column with the law and one column with pictures, almost like comic pictures, rows and rows and rows of figures, enacting whatever's going on in the court and so on. And most of it's about men talking to men about the law, and men inheriting and so on. But there's certain aspects of women's inheritance that are very interesting.
And the women were not themselves writing much. So this would be one
outside that circle, there was Hildegard of Bingen, who was very, very powerful in writing. And German women actually did better than others in the 12th and 13th century. 14th less so. But the very amusing scene in this book, and it sets the whole scene for women, is that they claimed that way back with Charlemagne, the emperor, a woman called Calphurnia showed her behind when she got angry with him in court, that she mooned at him. Like Hinterschama, behind shame. And the artists don't quite know what to do with that. They have a woman fully clothed with a little sort of animal tail, wagging her finger naughtily at the emperor. But for that reason, it says, women can't represent themselves in court again. They get
That's a wonderful note. I hate to do this. I'm getting the clock is saying we're out
Good,
of time.
that's such a good
But
way to end.
That's a good exit line. I didn't know they were so aware of things in the Middle Ages. Madeline Caviness, I want to thank you very much for coming down this evening to be on the Writer's Block. I've enjoyed this thoroughly, and I want to say your work, both with Radiant Light and earlier in other books, is simply brilliant. And I hope that it spreads throughout Cape Ann.
Thank you so much. So do I. It's a great pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
I want to thank you in cable television land as well for being with us. If you've learned something from Professor Caviness about medieval art and its magic and seen some of that magic on the screen during the program, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us. Good night, and see you again next week. Bye-bye.